Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We'll get started in just a minute. For those of you just joining, we'll get started in just a minute or two. We're seeing that there are people joining the software, so we want to give them a moment to get situated. All right, let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Amy Bucher and I'm our Vice President of Behavior Change Design here at MadPow. Presumably you're somewhat familiar with MadPow if you've joined us today, but just as to level set, we leverage strategic design and the psychology of motivation to create innovative experiences and compelling digital solutions that are good for people and good for business. So we are a strategic design consultancy located in Portsmouth, New Hampshire and Boston, Massachusetts. And we work with clients all across the healthcare and financial experience ecosystems to design solutions that, as it says here, really are good for people and good for business. The three pillars of our organization, our kind of sweet spots, are first of all digital solutions, and really delivering an exceptional customer experience with digital at the center. Experience innovation, so really thinking from a service design perspective and thinking through the various layers that are involved in that. And then behavior change design, which is my specialty and my expertise, really leveraging psychology to shift behaviors into new patterns. And if you're interested in the work we do, we actually have an event next week, our Financial Experience Design Conference, which is annual. It is virtual this year, and you can find out more about it by going to fxdconf.com. It will be on the 21st and the 22nd, and it is full of excellent presentations from folks at MadPow, as well as some of the financial services organizations we work with that will shed light on the psychology of motivation, design, and really creating exceptional customer experiences in the financial services space. Just a little bit about the webinar today. We are using GoToWebinar. The presentation, which is pre-recorded and I'll start in a moment, is approximately 45 minutes long, and then we'll have about 10 minutes of live Q&A. So please enter your questions into the question box as the webinar plays along so that we can keep track and we can be sure to answer your questions. If you do run out of time, you can email us directly at communications@madpow.com, and that will get your questions into the queue. But this question box is the ideal place to put it. And then you will also see there's a handout section on the little control panel where you can download a PDF version of the slides if that makes it easier for you to follow along today. So with that, I'm going to start the webinar content, and I look forward to seeing you again in about 45 minutes for some conversation. All right, let me just also share, hold on, I have just a slide with my contact information, the final one from the webinar that I'll share on the screen for anyone who wants to follow up afterwards, but I know there's been some good questions coming through the chat while the webinar was going on, so looking forward to, there we go. So you should be able to see now my contact information on the screen. Really happy to chat with people following, and thank you to everyone who's been submitting questions as we've gone. I've done a little bit of back and forth chat with some of you, and then others that I think are really interesting to discuss here. And one I want to start with is, how can you influence people's feelings of safety if you aren't a manager, which is really the case for most people in a workplace. So a way that I've talked about this before when I've been talking to volunteer organizations, for example, is thinking of yourself as a citizen leader. So someone who maybe doesn't have that formal experience, that formal position as a leader. And one of the things that I think is really important is, first of all, trying to model behavior yourself. So doing what you would expect others to do, very similar to how it's important for managers to walk the talk. There's been some evidence from, it was published in Science, which is an extremely reputable publication, that said that around 25 to 30% of people in a population doing a behavior seems to be the tipping point where it becomes like a normal accepted way of doing things. So even if you feel like you might be the only one doing something like wearing a mask, it ultimately starts to make a difference as you become part of that 25, 30, 40% of people who are doing it. And then also think about the people in your own small circle who you can encourage, the folks that you're closest to. People are very, very influenced by their peers. When we do work in health, we find that peer recommendations are usually like the number one reason why somebody might check out a service or engage in a new behavior. And similarly, if you're comfortable having those conversations with the people you're actually close to, that's a great way that you can be influential to them. So we have a question: if you need to prioritize all of these approaches, what would you recommend? If they all need to be addressed, to what level should be enough? And that's a great question, because I certainly threw the kitchen sink to you all. And I think it's not realistic for any organization to implement an entire broad range of strategies all at once. With any behavior change, we typically recommend prioritizing and starting with the highest priorities. And then as people or groups build that sense of self-efficacy, that sense of ability to make change, and things become a little easier because you've learned how to do them, they've become maybe habits, then you can start to add in new behaviors. So I think people hate when I give this answer, but it's the truth. You really have to do the research in your own organization to understand which of these tactics are going to be the highest priority for you. So I think it really depends a lot on the type of work that you do and the type of setup you have. And I say this as somebody, I'm working in a distributed remote environment right now. And so things like, the physical safety and the PPE are less of a concern for my work, because that's all something that employees are handling on their individual basis. Whereas, my husband is a laboratory-based engineer who has to go in and work in a facility. And so for him in his workplace, some of these concerns about making PPE available and putting reminders in places where they're really visible and really actionable, that's more important. So it does come from a sense of understanding what your workplace is like and what some of the perhaps more difficult aspects might be for the people in that workplace. So it depends. I'm sorry, I know people like a more definitive answer, but if you want to do the best possible outcome, it really does depend. I'm just browsing through some of the questions here. There's been a couple of interesting questions around sort of this difference between perception and reality. So there's and it's taken a few different forms. So one is like, is it important just to make people feel safe, or should they actually be safe? And ideally, we're connecting the science, the communication, and the behavior so that the things we're asking people to do ultimately lead to their increased safety. And we've seen some difficulty with respect to coronavirus specifically, because it is, two things really. It's such a new virus, this particular, the novel coronavirus. Especially early on, there was a lot we didn't know, a lot of speculation, or at times contradictory information coming from, from scientists, from news organizations. And that creates doubt in people's minds. They feel like they can't trust any information if they're getting conflicting information, or if information is changing, even though that's kind of a normal part of scientific discovery, that as we learn more, we sometimes do have to go back and adjust what we think we understand. So, I think that's given people a little bit of doubt, but ideally the things that we're asking people to do ultimately will truly keep them safer. And so one example where the science seems to be really coming to a consensus is that wearing masks is a very helpful thing, because the virus is aerosolized and it's released when people breathe, and you breathe it in, and that's how you catch it. And so that's an example of something where the masking, which is highly visible, that's actually a good thing, because it helps people start to feel like it's a normal thing to do. It starts to make it feel like part of the culture, but also that it has an effect of reducing transmission. And then there's another aspect of this question, which is there's sort of your individual safety and there's the safety of others, and they don't always overlap one-to-one. So you might be a person who's at lower risk or at higher risk, but we're all at different risk levels depending on our age, whether we have pre-existing health conditions, things like that. And how do we basically help people make decisions about safety behaviors that don't necessarily relate just to your own risk level? This isn't the way the person who asked it phrased it. This is sort of my interpretation of it. My choices as a relatively healthy younger person might be all right for me, but they may be endangering others in my life who are at a higher risk. And so how do we help communicate that sense of kind of shared or pooled risk? And I think that stories are a really important vehicle here, really trying to help people think about their group membership, not just in their professional group, who oftentimes are people who are of similar ages and backgrounds and things like that, but the different groups that we belong to. Our family units tend to be much more blended in terms of the different age groups represented. And I think sometimes that can be a really helpful thing for people when they're thinking about, like, oh, I may feel like I'm really safe at work with, the other folks who are carrying out similar sorts of tasks, but when I go home, I'm potentially exposing my grandmother, who is much older and in a more vulnerable state. Let's see. Oh, this is a good one. For employees working in an environment that requires in-person work, how can we better encourage safety precautions outside of work? And I think that's a really important question. I've seen a graphic going around that really resonates with me, that it shows, basically it's a series of concentric circles with people in them. And it's like, this is what you think your bubble is like. And it shows an individual and then the folks that they interact with on a first-degree basis. And then it's like, this is what your bubble is actually like. And then each person in that first-degree circle has their own bubble with extended individuals. And it starts to communicate this picture of just extended risk, and how the things that we do outside of one context can be brought back into another. So one of the things is actually helping people to think about it that way. Another dynamic that I think is really interesting here, and I haven't seen any articles or anything about this, this is my perception, but I think that people have a tendency to believe that their own folks are safe. So they feel they feel like it's very low risk to mingle with their family or their close friends, because these are people that they trust, that they love, that they know well. And in reality, their risk for coronavirus has nothing to do with how loved or trusted or wonderful they are. Like, a lot of very wonderful people have become ill because diseases do not care how wonderful you are. And so finding a way to communicate to people that this all adds up, that you're taking on additional risk. A metaphor that I've used in my own life that has been helpful to me when I have these tendencies is the idea of risk bucks. I think of myself as having a certain budget that I can spend toward risk, but when I run out of it, I have to wait for my next paycheck, basically. I have to wait for enough time to pass where I know that the risk has receded. Like, I know that I didn't get sick from the risk that I took. And I keep my personal risk budget pretty tight, but I found the metaphor is really helpful to me when I'm tempted by a situation to say, like, you know what, I did that thing for work last week and that was a little bit risky, and I went to the dentist and that was a little bit risky, and I really am going to have to wait until I spend any more risk bucks on anything, or else I might get somebody into trouble. All right, so we're actually a little bit past time. I want to thank everybody for coming. We'll have the recording available on the, I'm sure you'll find out via email actually, but it'll most certainly be on the MadPow website. And we appreciate any follow-up. So I hope that we'll see some of you at FXD next week. And thank you very much for attending today.